Welcome everyone to this video for the ResQ approach study in which I will try to define, conceptualize what the ResQ approach sees as mechanism. It's called all mechanisms, their concepts and mechanism concepts, and it will become clear why I use those words, the word mechanism concept. Now, first of all, there is a need for a disclaimer. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not saying that this is the conceptualization of a mechanism that should be used by all realist evaluators, by all realist researchers. It is a approach. It is a conceptualization. I'm not saying that it's better. I'm just saying that here's something to think about. And here, this is also a work in progress. So any comments, suggestions, critiques are very much appreciated to improve this, or just throw it away into the dustbin. That's also, of course, a possibility. So just a small outline that we will look at today. So the ResQ approach in a nutshell, in a really small nutshell. We'll look at realist generative mechanisms, abstraction and concepts, Goertz social science concepts, the thing. We'll look at what it means later on. And we'll look at mechanism concepts. First of all, the ResQ approach. So the ResQ approach is a methodology which I developed during my postdoc, FWO postdoc fellowship. It stands for Realist Evaluation Science and Qualitative Comparative Analysis, and it is explained in this article that has been published in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. So it is based on realist evaluation by Pawson and Tilley, and more specifically, on the realist evaluation science, which Pawson put forward in his book The Science of Evaluation, a Realist Manifesto, his book of 2013, I guess. We're not going to go into depth what is realist evaluation science, what is qualitative comparative analysis. You can look at that in the paper or in other publications that are out there. Also, some recordings on the website resqstudy.com. Just quickly about the ResQ approach. That is, I think, useful to understand why I conceptualize mechanisms in this way. So, as already mentioned, it combines realist evaluation science with qualitative comparative analysis. Important to mention realist and scientific realism. Realist evaluation is based on scientific realism, but very much influenced also by the view on mechanisms by Bhaskar in his book A Realist Theory of Science. And the objective of the ResQ approach is to synthesize research and evaluations to create program theories. And so here we see a figure created by Pawson in his book, The Science of Evaluation. And so every circle is a program. And I'm going to use my pointer here in the program to show you what I mean. So here every circle is a program or a number of programs of a specific intervention, and we do evaluations. And actually, we always start from scratch. We always start to do an evaluation, we report to the policymakers, and that's it. And then if someone else does another evaluation on maybe a similar program, and we start from scratch, and we do a theory, we create a theory maybe, and then we do an evaluation, and etc. And so we continuously try to reinvent the wheel. There are ways of not starting from scratch, but synthesizing the information that we have from these evaluations. And one way of doing it is through reviews, either systematic reviews, literature reviews, scoping reviews, realist reviews. But what happens is that we only look at programs within a specific substantive program domain. For example, welfare domain, the domain of crime, the domain of employment, the domain of education, etc. And we look at interventions that are relatively similar within that domain. For example, here we have review A, reviewing evaluations or papers or studies on an intervention within the employment sector. Here we have review B in the development sector. Realist evaluation of science takes a different route and says, okay, no, we should ignore those substantive program domains and look at program theory domains. And so the idea is that we have a lot of different families of interventions that are very similar and have a very similar program theory, a very similar explanation how they create outcomes. And so these family interventions, they occur across the different domains, even across context. For example, an incentivization intervention. So an intervention is based on incentivizing beneficiaries or stakeholders can be present in the welfare sector or in the crime sector or in the health sector, etc. And so these, whether that is in the health sector, in the environment sector, or in the welfare sector, the theory of change, underlying program theory, will be very similar because they're all incentivization interventions. And so according to realist evaluation science, we need to treat those theories as conceptual platforms. So the incentivization theory, the target setting theory, or at least the program theory for a target setting intervention, behavior change, etc., as conceptual platforms, and take our learnings from these evaluations, from the different program domains, to strengthen our conceptual platforms, our conceptual knowledge or theoretical knowledge about those theories. Now, in the ResQ approach, I basically take a step backwards, and I take not as a generic conceptual platform those theories, but the components of those theories. And here I look at mechanisms. So for me, all those theories are composed of mechanisms, and especially also because in reality, very often an intervention is not just an incentivization intervention or a target sector or behavior change. Often many interventions have different components of different families of interventions together. And so we cannot just take them apart. And so therefore I go to a more, let's say, atomic level, right? And use the mechanisms as a conceptual platform, because indeed a mechanism like extrinsic motivation or peer pressure or self-efficacy, they occur in the different program theories. For example, extrinsic motivation occurs in incentivization, is relevant for target setting, is also probably relevant for behavior change. And so the focus of the ResQ approach is on those mechanism concepts and gathering information on what triggers those mechanisms. And so in creating a program theory, we first have to define what those mechanisms are, bring them together, and then create a theory for that specific intervention. Of course, it's always important to see how they collaborate together. So then we go back to the level of the theory, or if we can make an analogy with molecules and atoms, the mechanisms are atoms, and then the theory are molecules. But of course, when those atoms work together, we have emergence, and in the molecules, they might act differently with each other. So that's something that we have to look at a later level. But first, of course, we need to understand how the mechanisms work, and then we can understand how they work when they are acting together. And so these are the 5 steps of a ResQ approach, which can be found in the paper. And so very quickly, what is crucial here are these here, the initial mechanism concepts, which are also the outcome or update initial theories, which are initial mechanism concepts. So basically, when we do a ResQ approach study, we start by identifying the relevant mechanisms of the intervention under study, right? So they come from different sources, theoretical, conceptual, and analytical frameworks. And we look at, okay, what are the mechanisms here that are relevant for this intervention, that will probably be triggered by this intervention. Then we look in different disciplines, and we look for different contextual conditions, looking at different theories from those different research, substantive theories related to the mechanisms. And we combine these formal theories using theory knitting to create mechanism concepts. Right? For each mechanism concept, we perform a search, a case-based review, we collect the data, we process the data, perform a qualitative comparative analysis, and we bring the different mechanism concepts together to create a comprehensive theory of an intervention. So very quickly, this is the stepwise approach to the ResQ approach, which can be found in the earlier mentioned article. Now, this is not the focus of this presentation, of this video. The focus is on, okay, what are these mechanism concepts actually, and why are they so important, and what basically justifies us using these mechanism concepts as our conceptual platforms within a ResQ approach. So we need to first look at, okay, what are realist generative mechanisms, right? Realist generative mechanisms, as for example defined by Bhaskar. And so by showing or giving several definitions, we'll try to really get into the conceptualization of a mechanism for our purpose of the ResQ approach. And so this is a table that realists probably will know. It's made by Bhaskar in his book, The Realist Theory of Science. And here we see that there are three domains: the domain of the real, the domain of the actual, and the domain of the empirical. And actually, these are the three stratified, three ontological strata of reality. So according to realism, reality is ontologically stratified in three domains. And so the empirical is the one that we see. These are our experiences, right? The empirical are the experiences, the actual are the events which we experience, and the mechanisms or the structures are causing these, generating these events in the domain of the actual. So the mechanism and the structures are in the domain of the real. And the domain of the real is very crucial to understand that this is, and what we call, or what Bhaskar called, the intransitive part of reality, the intransitive part in science, because they exist, the domain of the real, the mechanisms and the structures, they exist independent of us as researchers and evaluators knowing anything about them or having an influence on them. So whether we are there or not, they exist. Even if we don't know that they exist, they exist. These mechanism structures do not always, but can generate events. For example, gravity doesn't always generate an event, yet it is always present around us. So for example, a tree might stand up in a forest, but it's not because it's not falling down that it is that there's no gravity at work. So then we have the events which happen in the domain of the actual, right? And so this means that, for example, when a tree falls, that's an event. But again, it's not because there is an event that we also manage to experience it. There's someone that to experience it, to hear it, to see it, to observe it. So that doesn't mean that it is present in the domain of the empirical, it is present in the experience. So that's very important to take into account. And what the essential thing here is that in realism, critical scientific realism, we aim to focus on the domain of the real, trying to understand mechanisms and structures, which are then manifested or which are observed within the domain of the actual and the empirical. And here are just some definition of what a mechanism is. So here, for example, by Bhaskar. So Bhaskar says mechanisms are powers or liabilities of a thing, and that's very important. The thing is very crucial. We'll come to that later, and you already see it in the table of contents, which may be exercised. So here we see may be exercised. It's not because the tree doesn't fall down and there's no gravity. May be exercised without being manifest in any particular outcome. And this is what is called the context sensitiveness of those mechanisms, of those powers or liabilities, because depending on the context, they will be exercised or they will be manifest in any particular outcome, or they will create an event that we can observe. Andrew Sayre says, objects and social relations have causal powers, which may or may not produce regularities, and which can be explained independently of them. Objects and social relations have causal powers. So the thing that has been referenced here comes back here as objects and social relations. And they have causal powers, which may or may not produce regularities. Regularities are correlations that we discuss, what we observe in our domain of the empirical. And many approaches, like statistical approaches, like the positivist philosophy of science, only focus on the domain of the empirical or conflate the domain of the actual and the domain of the empirical, but does not think that there is actually something like a domain of the real. So the statistics only focus here at regularities here, whereas a realist researcher will focus on here and will say, well, there can be regularities here, but they need not be there in order for a mechanism to be present as well. So it's not because there is no regularity that can be observed according to the rules of statistics that there is no mechanism that is at work. Okay, so that's already, again, relates to what we discussed earlier. It's not because we don't hear a tree falling down that there's nowhere a tree falling down. And so these are two definitions, basically, of what mechanisms are. And again, I emphasize the importance of this thing here, right? Other definitions. Mechanisms explain causal relations by describing the powers inherent in a system. So here again we have powers inherent in a system. Interesting. We talk about a system now, right? We came from a thing to objects and social relations, and now we talk about inherent in a system. Okay. Mechanisms, again, Pawson, and structures from the domain of the real, they tell us what it is about that system, again, system, that generates uniformity. Uniformity we talk about here is a regularity or something that we observe, a regularity between the context or contextual conditions and an outcome. What Westhorp says then on mechanisms is mechanisms should involve the description of at least three things. The necessary components of the system. So again, we're talking about a system. We talked about a thing, social relations. Now we're talking about necessary components of that thing, of that system. The necessary relationships between those components and the processes or interactions. So the mechanisms should involve the description of these three things. Interesting. Okay, having discussed all that, right, having looked at those definitions, let's now take another step or a step backward or a side step and look at what it means about abstraction and concept. What does that have to do with this? Okay, abstraction means that if we are to pursue the idea of knowledge accumulated across relative relations, we will need some degree of shared conceptual grounding, right? So abstraction and concept, abstraction is really crucial when it comes to realist evaluation. The same can be said by Pawson's 7 organizing principles of realist evaluation. Again, he emphasizes the idea of theory and abstraction, right? So abstraction and conceptualization apparently are very crucial when we talk about mechanisms in the realist evaluations, right? And of course, realist evaluation, and we talked about program theories in one of the initial slides. We talked about generic conceptual platforms there, and of course, realist evaluation is really built up around program theories. And of course, a good scientific concepts are the building blocks of good program theory. So a program theory really cannot live without good scientific concepts. And so if you want to explain through a theory how a mechanism works or what a mechanism is, we need concepts to describe them and to learn from each other. Now, this is not only realist evaluation that says how important, that explains how important these concepts are. So, for example, Bhaskar mentions there is a difference in general between scientific and lay explanations. What primarily distinguishes scientific from the explanation of events is not their structure, but the concepts that figure in them, right? So the concepts are really crucial for scientific explanation. The qualitative nature of social objects and relations on which causal mechanisms depend bring us back to the vital task of conceptualization. That's Andrew Sayer that's saying that. And then again, abstraction is the activity of identifying particular constituents. Okay, now remark the analogies with the definition of a mechanism, right? We're talking here about identifying particular constituents and their effects. Abstraction is of course linked to conceptualization, right? The qualitative nature of social objects and relations, remember what Sayer said earlier, and which causal mechanisms depend on which causal, again, here's the thing which later became the system, on which causal mechanisms depend, right, brings us back to the vital task of conceptualization. So we need conceptualization in order to understand these causal mechanisms, right? And remember here, what we talked about here, the necessary components of the system. Westhorp talked about that. Here again, we talk about identifying the particular constituents and their effects of a mechanism. And so it's very important to understand that when we talk about abstraction, when we talk about concept, it is not about making it more vague. And that's sometimes a critique that is being given when I sometimes say, okay, we need use more concepts. And people say, yeah, but we want to make it specific for this intervention. And what I want us to make clear with this slide is to show that abstraction and conceptualization is really not about making it more vague. It is actually about making it even more specific. So for example, it is not about going from the specific to a more general, like for example, here you have a specific blue rectangle, a specific orange rectangle, or a lighter blue rectangle, and we make abstraction of that, and so we just say it's a rectangle, right? We'll take the least common denominator, okay? The smallest common denominator, sorry. That's not what it is about. What we're talking about is contingent versus essential characteristics. And so this is what is happening here. We're not interested actually in the color, or we're not interested in the shape of this in the shape. It's this constituent element with the star that is relevant and that is crucial for the understanding of the concept. And I always make the example of a situation in which we try to explain why people, or how it come people went from A to B and didn't get wet while it was raining all day long. Right? So people went from A to B without getting wet, and it didn't from A to B and didn't get wet while it was raining. Now you can generate data, and you go look and why didn't they get wet? Well, person one, the first person, went from A to B using a red Lamborghini and didn't get wet. Person number two went from A to B using a green Lada and didn't get wet. Person three went from A to B using a yellow Toyota and didn't get wet. Right? So if you want to do abstraction or conceptualization from this kind, we would say they didn't get wet because they used a car. Right? That's not wrong. It's a conceptualization, it's a concept, and it's not wrong. It's a generalization, and it explains why they didn't get wet from A to B. This abstraction or kind of conceptualization would say, no, it's not the issue is here not that it's a car, because there are cabrio cars which have no roof, so they would have gotten wet. So it's not sufficiently explanatory. What is going on? It is they used a vehicle, which means that explains why they got from A to B, that has a roof, which explains why they didn't get wet. So our conceptualization, our abstraction is now they used a vehicle with a roof. And this is a different kind of conceptualization, making abstraction, because we now focus on the elements, the specific constituent parts of the situation that are causally relevant, right? And that means also that we are more specific, but at the same time we're also more general, because we say it's a vehicle with a roof, it also includes, for example, those BMW motorcycles with a roof on top. That's also a vehicle with a roof, which it's not a car, but it also will help you to get from A to B without getting wet, right? So this conceptualization or making abstraction of these three different empirical findings leads to a more specific and at the same time also more generalizable, right? Because we are focusing on the essential causal elements within those structures. And so I think some examples of what they are, and of course the rationale behind the use of such concepts and such abstraction is that if we do so, we can learn, and we're going to go all the way back to what we said here, right? We want to learn from these different evaluations. And if you want to do so, we need common language, we need common concepts, we need common theories, we need to be able to communicate with each other. And so concepts are really crucial when we want to communicate mechanisms toward each other. And so the only way, because of course we use concepts, but we use concepts and we give a definition which we agreed upon among our peers. But here, what we will see later when we talk about Gary Goertz's conceptualization of the mechanism, or the social science concept, we will see that the causal factor becomes much more important. So that is why abstraction and conceptualization are actually so important, And here are some examples of what I mean. So here you have examples of, for example, extrinsic motivation can be seen as a mechanism, self-efficacy, the price mechanism, groupthink. They are all established concepts within the literature, within the scientific literature, of which we know that have a reason. And so to put it into practice, we see here, for example, this is a mechanism which was, I'm not going to mention the paper because it doesn't really matter, in a paper, and you see a whole long text and the demand by the district to comply with the mandatory guidelines while trying to compete with external vendors for students' business incentivizes vendors to change. So this is the mechanism, which is actually, when we look at it conceptually, externally regulated motivation as being defined by self-determination theory. Right? Here we have staff may feel they have the capacity, capability, and authority to influence a situation. A lot of words just to explain self-efficacy. So if we use the word self-efficacy, that would link up with the whole theory, social cognitive theory, and a whole plethora of research and evaluations that focus also on self-efficacy. Here again, social context, similar illness experiences help to correct misperceptions about their capabilities. Here we're talking about social comparison. So the idea here, or the call, is to use those concepts within your realist evaluations. When you're doing a realist evaluation, use those concepts that we know of instead of reinventing the wheel, because using those concepts will make it easier to build on each other and to connect with a wider theoretical literature. Now, let's take a closer look now at what those concepts actually are and how should we define them and how should we use them within, and how does the ResQ approach actually use them within its approach and within its synthesis. And so therefore we go and look at Goertz social science concept. It's a book. Recently the second edition was published, and Goertz actually says that concepts are theories about the fundamental constitutive elements. Interesting, right? Again, the fundamental constitutive elements comes back to what Westhorp said, and comes back to what we saw earlier as well on abstraction of a phenomenon. And the analysis of concepts involves ascertaining the constitutive characteristics of a phenomenon that have central causal powers, right? So here I refer to my example of the cars. Again, the central causal power. It's a vehicle, it can move, and it can move and transport things, and the fact that it has a roof which protects people from the rain. So again, this is the conceptualization of, or the conceptualization of concepts according to Goertz. And it's different from other conceptualizations of concepts. And so what is important is that this conceptualization of concept is ontological because it focuses on what constitutes a mechanism, right? It is causal because it identification of ontological attributes that play a key role in causal hypothesis. So as mentioned, it's not going from the different cars and the brands and their color to a car, but it's really looking for the ontological attributes that play a key role in explaining what has happened or explaining a causal theory, a causal claim. And it is realist because it's based on an empirical analysis of the mechanism, which means that when we do more research, when new empirical data is being analyzed, when new evaluations are being done, the definition of that concept will change. It will change and will be adapted because it's in relation to empirical reality. Because it is in relation to an empirical reality, it also gives the opportunity to connect across cultures, across contexts, and across domains. Because we are not using specific jargon, we're not using specific empirical, contextual elements. We're using the data, the reality. We're trying to use, and this is important, we're trying to use the untransitive part of reality, the causal structures. And this is something we'll come back to later. And so according to Goertz, there's a three-level structure when it comes to social science concepts. First, there's the basic level, which is the concept itself, the mechanism, for example, self-efficacy. Then there's a secondary level which explains it's the theory about the interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. So this is really about, again, see the resemblances with what Westhorp, for example, said about the necessary components, the interrelationships between those components. And so again, this comes back in this conceptualization of concept, in this three-level structure. So basic level is the concept itself. Secondary level is theory about the interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. And then the tertiary level is the indicator and the data level. So based on that theory about interrelationships, we can develop indicators at the data level to study this mechanism. And so our focus here is on this secondary level, which is the theory about interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. And so let's recall everything a little bit. So what have we been looking into right now? So first of all, mechanisms are powers or liabilities of a thing which may be exercised without being manifest in any particular outcome. Secondly, mechanisms should involve the description of at least three things: the necessary components of the system, the necessary relationships between those components, and the process of or interactions. Abstraction is the activity of identifying particular constituents and their effects. And the three-level structure of concepts by Goertz, the secondary level, is specifically relevant, which is a theory about the interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. So remember, recognize the similarities between these very different authors, although they are often talking about different things. Here we're talking about the conceptualization by Goertz. We're talking about interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. Here again, identifying particular constituents. Here again, components of the system, relationship between those components. And this refers then to the thing which has a power, which is a mechanism, which may be exercised without being manifest, etc., etc. Now we're going to talk about, okay, but what exactly is this thing that possesses powers? Is this thing that here comes as a system? Is this thing that we're trying to identify the particular constituents of? Is this thing that the interrelation of the parts of the conceptual whole, right? What is this thing? Okay. For this, I'm going to focus here a little bit on this figure by Sayre. And so it depicts a little bit the causal explanation, the causal nature of reality of the mechanism. And so in realism, basically. And so we have a structure, and I specifically call it causal structure, which has power, a liability, which has a mechanism, which leads to an outcome, but only in certain conditions it leads to a specific outcome or phenomenon. So it's context sensitive, and these conditions are actually other mechanisms. Right? And if we translate this to realist evaluation, where we talk of CMO configuration, so if you're not from realist evaluation, it might be a little bit jargon, or you might not necessarily know what we're talking about, but it's not necessarily problematic. But for those in realist evaluation, if you want to transpose this to CMO configurations, actually these conditions are the context, the mechanism, and the outcome, right? And so it's important, I want to stress this here, because this is something that is sometimes very, hard to say, confusing in the literature on realist evaluation, because sometimes we use the context triggers a mechanism that leads to an outcome, and sometimes it's being seen as the context moderates the outcome of the mechanism. And so context is often being used in two different ways, either as a conditions that intervene between the mechanism and the outcome that we're trying to study, or as something actually more here, causal structure that triggers a specific mechanism, right? But I think if you look, and according to Sayre as well, and according to other experts, I think that if we look into the literature on CMO, the theoretical literature, what actually is meant by Pawson and Tilley is the C is actually right here, the conditions. And the causal structure is actually assumed to be the intervention itself. So the intervention is seen, according to relativity, as the thing that possesses the mechanism. And what we're trying to do here in the ResQ group is actually move the C to the structure. We're actually going to try to understand what triggers this mechanism. What is the causal structure that gives rise, I would always say, rather than trigger, gives rise to the mechanism, which then leads to the outcome depending on the context. And so the context that we try to focus on, or the outcome, sorry, is as close as possible to the mechanism in order to minimize the effect or the influence of these conditions. And we'll come back to that later when we discuss a specific figure. But let's first look here. So and not some other definitions again. Explaining why a certain mechanism exists involves discovering the nature of the structure. So again, very crucial, very interesting, right? The nature of a structure, right, or object which possesses that mechanism or power. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to explain why a certain mechanism exists by discovering the nature of the structure, right? So this is here. This is the nature of the structure. Okay, I've lost my. Okay, sorry. Events arise from workings of mechanisms which derive from the structures of objects. So again, we have here the reference to the structure, to causal structures that have mechanisms, that possess powers. And so this is the thing where Bhaskar refers to when he talks about powers and liabilities. So some examples of what are those causal structures actually, okay, to get a better understanding of what we can expect of such a causal structure. So an example is metal, copper, iron, and it has a power, or the possibility, the power to conduct electricity, right? And it has that power because there's an atomic structure with free electrons. So it's clear that the causal structure is embedded within the metal, right? It's not because it's a metal, it is because it has an atomic structure with free electrons that it's a metal, right? And so the causal structure, the structure of the atomic structure with free electrons of the metal is the reason why it is able to conduct electricity. If we look at wood and the mechanism of combustion, or the power of combustion, we see that outside oxygen is actually very important. It's crucial for combustion. When we think of combustion, oxygen is central, takes a central part, but oxygen is not necessarily within the wood. Oxygen is outside. So even though it is key, we would think that, well, it's part of the structure that possesses that mechanism, but it's not part of the actual object that we're talking about. So with metal, it was clear that it's an actual object, right? For example, this pen, we can grab it, it's clear, it's delineated, it's an object. However, when we talk about combustion and wood, we include oxygen, which is around and which is not necessarily, which is, I would say, it's part of the causal structure, but it's not necessarily part of the object that we are grabbing, the tangible object. If we then go through financial incentives, and the mechanism is extrinsic motivation, we see that financial incentives are always part of a completely interrelated system, a socially interrelated system of conditions that are certainly not part of the financial incentive, which might be a paper bill of €5 or something, right? It depends on the where you are, of course, what that €5 means to somebody, whether that is a €5 or whether that is 5 shilling or €5 or 5 yen or $5 will probably also make a difference. So it's all whether you are getting that $5 within a country that accepts that currency, etc., etc. So whether it is an extrinsic motivation is really much more dependent on outside factors than it is actually on that $5 or €5 bill. So it's part of an interrelated system, and so we can conclude that that thing is not necessarily a clearly delineated object. So it is not necessarily like society or an organization or an intervention or a person that possesses powers, right? It's really looking at the causal structure is really much more dispersed. And so, for example, an intervention might have many different components. So you have individuals. An intervention might have stakeholders. There might be monitoring going on. There are leaders. There are rules and norms. There is an aspect of gaming. There is a communication which is part of every intervention. And so every part of the intervention, every component has different characteristics that might be relevant, and together they will lead to an outcome, but it is their interaction that makes that it leads to an outcome, and it is this interaction between those different conditions and aspects of the context that we would call the thing, or rather the causal structure. So the thing, from now on, we call it the causal structure. So it's in the interrelation. Again, we are repeating words that we've been hearing from the beginning on. The interrelationships between the constituting components, between components, the interactions between the components, those form the causal structure which leads to a specific mechanism, or that constitute a mechanism. So we can actually see that those causal structures as subsystems of society, right? And so then we go to systems thinking and look for a definition here. And so what is interesting here, definition of systems, a set of elements or parts that is coherently organized and interconnected in a pattern or structure that produces a characteristic set of behaviors, often classified as its function or purpose. So it's interconnected in a pattern, right? Interconnected. Again, that word, interrelation, interconnected. The structure that produces a characteristic set of behaviors or a mechanism, often classified as its function or purpose. So that's the definition of a system. If we then translate this to what we've been discussing, not namely generative mechanisms, we can take it as a set of elements or parts that is interconnected in a structure that constitutes a causal power or mechanism. Okay, so that's basically here the definition that we will use for a mechanism concept in analogy with the systems definition. And so this is a representation, a visual representation of what we've been talking about here right now. So let's go through a little bit. So here we have context. So we're talking about the CMO. Keep in mind, we're talking about the CMO configuration within realist evaluation. So here we talk about context, right? This is our outcome. Now we're looking for, and what we're trying to look for is the mechanism, right? This is an observed empirical relationship. Now we're trying to understand what is the mechanism that explains this uniformity that we've observed, right? So then we have a context, and within that context, which we observe, so it's in the domain of the empirical, we've observed this context. But this context, and I've called this empirical barriers. So this context consists of empirical barriers, which are empirical carriers of causal structures. All right. So here, through abstraction, we can understand what these causal structures are within the context. And so we're trying to look for causal structures that are ontologically linked to a mechanism. Right. There's an ontological relationship to a mechanism. So we're looking for causal structures that are carried by, which are present in empirical carriers that are ontologically related to a mechanism, and that together with other mechanisms lead to our outcome of interest. And so this is the causal relationship. And so if we talk in sense of context, mechanism, outcome configuration, what we see is that what is often in practice being used is that, well, this is the outcome, of course. This is the mechanism. And these, the empirical carriers of these other causal structures are often seen as context, or are often used as context. Or sometimes we also use other mechanisms as context, but that's very, very rarely being done. So what we're actually, when we talk of CMO configuration, it are those empirical carriers in the context that are the empirical carriers of the other causal structures that are that give rise to the mechanism that are intervening in this relationship between context and outcome of interest. This is the mechanism, and this is then the outcome, which arises because these mechanisms and this mechanism is interacting towards a certain outcome of interest. And so I put here the proxy equivalent, the idea of proxy equivalent put forward by Jagosh. And I think here, this is what we're trying to do within the ResQ approach. We're trying to discover the causal structure that gives rise to a mechanism. So there's an ontological relationship here. And we're trying to make sure in order to know whether that mechanism got triggered, we try to look for the proxy equivalent. And we try to put all the outcome of proxy equivalent as close as possible to the mechanism to make sure that we are actually not having the least possible other mechanisms intervening. So this is a theoretically closed system. Of course, we're not using them as they're not really, in this sense, they're a little bit confounding because we're actually trying to understand what the mechanism, what does this mechanism, we're not trying to understand yet, we're not yet trying to understand how this mechanism leads to this outcome. We're trying to understand when can we expect this mechanism. And once we've understood that, we can start by understanding how those different mechanisms interact to a specific outcome. So these are two different research endeavors. There are actually 3 or 4 different research endeavors within this one picture. There's also looking at, okay, in which different contexts, which different elements, empirical carriers exist that have the same causal structure, for example. This right here is a research agenda on its own. This, of course, is a research agenda on its own. This right here is a research agenda on its own. And this right here, this connection, is a research agenda on its own. The ResQ approach tries to focus on this one. So now we've come to mechanism concepts. Remember, mechanism concepts were the central part of our ResQ approach. We try to create initial mechanism concepts, try to update them to come to refined mechanism concepts. So what are they? So they're, remember, at the secondary level of our of the Gary Goertz conceptualization of social science concepts. So secondary level means it's a theory about the interrelationships of the parts of the conceptual whole. We also find that it's a theory on the fundamental conditions that constitute a specific mechanism, and it is a set of elements or parts that is interconnected in a structure that constitute a causal power or mechanism. And so when we bring that together, a mechanism concept, as I have conceptualized within the ResQ approach, is a theory on the fundamental interrelationships between elements and conditions that form a structure that constitutes a causal power, and thus is a causal structure or mechanism. And so causal power and mechanism, they are seen as somewhat interchangeably. I would say that the difference is that a causal power is something that is possessed. A mechanism, we can talk of a mechanism whenever we see that it generates an outcome. And then we talk about mechanism, but in essence, we can say that they are the same. Okay? Such a theory uses Boolean expressions because we have necessary and sufficient conditions, and it is developed, in this case, using the ResQ approach. And so, finally, to end this presentation, an example that I've been working on, so self-efficacy. So the definition by Bandura's theory of social cognitive theory is people's beliefs in their capabilities to produce desired effects by their actions. The constituting conditions are a relevant positive experience. They are derived from the theories and from empirical analysis. So these are them. And here we see how they are combined using Boolean logic and Boolean expressions. Here, this is and the plus means or. Okay, so this can be seen then as a mechanism concept, and depending on our empirical analysis, it might change. And this mechanism concept, so it defines, or it does not define, it indicates under which circumstance, in which condition, contextual conditions, this mechanism will be present or will be activated or will be present, which causal structure, and this is the causal structure, or these are actually several different causal structures, right? This is a causal structure, this is a causal structure, this can be seen as a causal structure. How these causal structures, which causal structures give rise to the mechanism of self-efficacy. And so this is the end of this presentation. So if you have any question, you can or remarks or comments or critiques, they can always be sent to dimitri.wiltremans@uantwerpen.be. If you want, you can also join our Antwerp Realist group, which is a group of realists researchers and evaluators that come together every 2 weeks, online of course, and discuss realist topics. I think the main takeaway point of this discussion was that we need to use much more scientific concepts within realist evaluations, use abstraction correctly, use conceptualization, and the use of a mechanism concept has been described right here, focusing on causal structures, might also be a way forward in understanding how interventions, evaluations, and eventually how society works in reality. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see some comments and remarks from your side.